What's up, guys? Welcome back. My name is Gemma Jade, and if you're new here, just welcome. I seem to have gotten my technical difficulties under control, so hopefully I can get this video done in the time that I have to do it. Today we're going to be talking about the disappearance of Kayla Berg. It's another episode of Disappeared that I have always kind of kept in my head throughout the years. Something about it just stuck with me. I tried to condense it a little bit. I went through my script numerous times to try to take out things that just, not that they're not relevant, but that didn't affect the case at all, or, didn't have anything to do with, you know, her disappearance. So I always encourage you to deep dive, to do your own investigations. So let's jump right in. Kayla Berg was born on August 29th, 1993, so she is a Virgo. Kayla was born in Antigo, Wisconsin, to her parents James Spandbauer and Hope Sprager. When she was just a toddler, Kayla's parents separated. They were never officially married, so there was no official divorce. And they kind of just went their separate ways. Kayla had an older brother, Jimmy, who was a few years older than her. And while Kayla and Jimmy did stay living with their mom, their father lived very close by, and they kind of came and go as they pleased from each parent's house. Kayla's mother, Hope, later stated in an interview, quote, "We had the every other weekend schedule, but if they wanted to go by Dad's, I was more than willing to let them go. The more time they could spend with him, I felt, was the best thing," end quote. Unfortunately, James was diagnosed with cancer around the time of the separation, and he had to move in with his parents, so Kayla and her brother Jimmy's grandparents, because I don't know what kind of cancer or how severe it was, but it seems like it was bad enough that he had to move in with his parents because he could no longer care for himself completely on his own. Kayla was described as, quote, "bubbly and optimistic," end quote. She, by all accounts, was just a sweet and down-to-earth teenage girl. Her family and friends said she was really just a typical 15-year-old teenage girl. I want to just give you a little picture of what Antigo, Wisconsin is like, or was like, back when all this took place in 2009. It's a very small town. It's less than 7 square miles, and the population, I believe still to this day, and at the time in 2009 when this took place, was less than 10,000 people. One of those sleepy rural towns and communities where everyone knows everyone else, and most likely everyone knows everyone else's business. The people that lived in this community weren't really, you know, worried about anything as far as, there was such a low crime rate. They thought it was a really great place to raise kids. There was really nothing going on. It was an outdoorsy kind of town. If you loved fishing and hiking and camping, this is the perfect place for you. If you loved those outdoors kinds of things, there was always something for you to do. Likely due to how close they were in age, Kayla and her brother Jimmy were extremely close, and they shared a lot of the same friend group. Family and friends say that Kayla had a talent for contorting and controlling her body. She was always jumping, flipping, tumbling, doing cartwheels, and one of her favorite things to do was to flip around on the trampoline. She eventually enrolled in gymnastics, and it quickly became a huge part of her life. She had a passion for it, and she felt that it was something that she was really meant to do. She was so passionate about gymnastics. It was basically her whole life at one point. Throughout her life, Kayla was a great student academically. She achieved good grades and high marks. I guess around her sophomore year, Hope, Kayla's mother, noticed that her grades did start slipping. She wasn't around much anymore. She was spending more and more weekends with her friends and out of the house. What Hope originally didn't know, though, was that while Kayla was spending more and more weekends away from home, she and her friends were not staying in Antigo. They were actually traveling about 60 miles away to the much larger town. I guess for these girls, it was the big city, and it was Wausau, Wisconsin. Wausau, Wisconsin was much different than Antigo. Like I said, it was much bigger, the population was much bigger, and there was way more to do. I think of this as like, I'm from Jersey, so Wausau would be like the New York City. I can't tell you how many times I was a teenager, I snuck into Times Square, just take the train right over from where I lived. Kayla and her friends were traveling to Wausau most weekends to spend time partying and meet new people and to just have fun and do things that they couldn't do in Antigo. Again, Wausau had much more opportunities for 15-year-old young teenage girls to have much more fun and the freedom that I'm sure that they craved living in such a small town of Antigo, where no matter where they turned, somebody knew them or their parents or both. Kayla's close friend Megan later stated that she was actually the one who introduced Kayla and their friend Natasha and a few of their other girls in their friend group to the Wausau scene, the partying scene there. She said her really close friends, her best friends, were in Antigo, where she lived, but she had also had a friend group in Wausau that were a bit older and that would throw these parties and hang out, and that's who they were going to see. So Megan introduced everybody. She wanted the best of both worlds. Why not introduce her best friends to her fun and partying friends? The girls would each tell the other's parents that they were staying at the other one's house. And the parents were never none the wiser because I guess these girls at this point were considered trustworthy. They would get rides from older friends, and these parties always had tons of alcohol, drugs readily available, mostly marijuana, but harder drugs were available if, you wanted them, if you wanted to find them. Frequently, the police even had to be called to break these parties up, and it wasn't unusual for Kayla and her friends to have to run from the house or the houses where these parties were being thrown to not get caught for underage drinking. So, a little wild, I guess you can say. It was at one of these parties where Kayla met her first real boyfriend, 19-year-old Miguel Marrero. He was allegedly a drug dealer, and most of the parties were actually thrown at his house that he shared with his brothers. And this house is going to come back into play later on. So I found the address. It was located at 1017 East Wausau Avenue. Eventually, he would start picking Kayla up, and she would just go and spend the weekend sometimes by herself to be with Miguel at the party house in Antigo, or he'd drive there to pick up her and her friends. Hope later stated that while she wasn't aware of Kayla's older boyfriend or her trips to Wausau, she did notice a major change in her daughter's behavior and the fact that her grades were slipping. She knew that something was going on with her daughter. She didn't know specifics, again, but she knew her child and she knew that something was definitely going on. In June of 2009, at the end of Kayla's sophomore year, Hope decided that she needed to sit her daughter down and talk to her about what was expected of her from her parents and to talk about what was going on with Kayla. The conversation ended with Kayla feeling really remorseful, saying she was sorry, she was going to try harder and do better to kind of get back into where she was and shape up a little bit. However, it was also this conversation that Hope decided to let Kayla know that she was having a really hard time making ends meet there in Antigo and was going to move to Texas to stay with her sister and some family because supposedly job opportunities were much more readily available for Hope in Texas. Kayla was seemingly devastated by this news, but Hope made it very clear that neither Kayla nor her brother Jimmy had to come to Texas with her. They were more than welcome to stay in Antigo, to stay with their father at their grandparents' house. She was not forcing them at all to go with her to Texas. Hope later stated, quote, "I wasn't going to make her go. It was entirely up to her if she wanted to stay by her dad. I didn't want to pull her away from everything," end quote. Kayla made the decision to go to Texas and to make a fresh start with her mother, while her brother Jimmy, since he had just graduated high school, decided to stay in Antigo and get his own place with a few of his friends. To make a long story short, Texas did not work out. Jobs were not more readily available than they were in Antigo. In fact, it was about the same thing. And even though they were welcome and very comfortable, greeted with open arms by Hope's family, they could never really relax there. And then they found out that while trying to enroll Kayla for her junior year in the school in Texas, in the high school, that there was no gymnastics team. And this was kind of like a deal breaker for Kayla. Hope and Kayla were both like really homesick. So within a little less than 2 months of being in Texas, they decided to turn back and go back to Antigo. Also, while they were in Texas in July of that year, they found out that Kayla's father, James, had taken a turn for the worse with his cancer and he wasn't doing very well. All I saw was he took a turn for the worse. I didn't see what happened. Again, I don't even Didn't even find out what cancer the man had or, how bad it was. So with that, they did decide in less than 2 months to go back home, like I said. On Sunday, August 22nd, 2009, mother and daughter arrived back in Antigo. Kayla's excitement was palpable. According to Hope, she just couldn't wait to see all of her family and friends again. Because she had given up her and Kayla's apartment because she thought she was going to be permanently moving to Texas to make this fresh start, Hope had nowhere to live when they got back. So Kayla was going to stay with her father at her grandparents' house, and Hope was going to be staying with friends for the time being until Hope was able to get them their own apartment again, which she was diligently working to try and do. This wasn't an ideal situation for either, especially Kayla, as her grandparents' home, I guess, was very small, and she was made to sleep in the upstairs hallway in a cot. But she didn't spend much time sleeping there anyway. She mostly kind of sat couch surfed and stayed a different night at this friend's, bounced from friend's house to friend's house, which she had kind of normally done anyway, even when her and her mother did have their own apartment. So it wasn't really anything new for Kayla to be bouncing from place to place to place. That's just how she was. On August 9th, 2009, Kayla told her father that she was going to be spending the night at her friend Natasha's house. The next day, when Kayla, who did not have a cell phone or a car or anything, she was only 15, hadn't called and did not show back up at the house, her father James was a little frustrated and decided to call Kayla's mom, Hope. Hope then called Natasha's mother, and here's where the girls got caught. Natasha had said she was staying at Kayla's, Kayla had said she was staying at Natasha's, and neither were at the other's house. The parents were extremely worried, though. As they talked, they realized that neither had spoken to either girl since the night before when they left and supposedly went to the other one's house, and the girls were essentially missing. This is when one of Kayla's other friends informs Hope about Wausau and Kayla's older boyfriend, who is now her ex-boyfriend, and the parties and all of that kind of stuff. This is when Hope finds out. This is when Hope and Natasha's mother decide to go down to the Antigo police station and fill out missing person paperwork. They're worried, they're scared to death, they're freaking out. And right in the middle of filling out the paperwork, they received a phone call that the two girls were located and had not traveled to Wausau at all, but had been to an outdoor party right there in Antigo, but neither had a cell phone and couldn't find a way to get in touch with any of their parents or anybody, and had essentially spent the night outside at this outdoor party right there in Antigo. But at this point, the cat was out of the bag about Wausau. Hope was extremely angry and told Kayla that going to Wausau, traveling that far alone without an adult at her age was not acceptable, and she was never to do it again. In no uncertain terms, that's it. She was putting her foot down. According to Hope, Kayla apologized. Again, she was remorseful, and again, she promised to do better and to try to get herself back on track for the future, for her upcoming junior year. As part of turning a new leaf, Hope requested that Kayla from now on stay in frequent contact with her however she could. Remember, Kayla could go days without speaking to her mother, and it was fine because her mother thought that she's a 15-year-old girl doing 15-year-old girl things. Now that her mother knew better, Kayla made a promise that, she wasn't going to be grounded or punished or anything, but she needed to keep in frequent contact and let Hope and her father, one of her parents at least, or both, know exactly where she was, who she was with at all times, and stay in almost constant contact. Kayla agreed, and she promised again to shape up and said this school year was going to be different. She was going to regain her mother's trust and really prove herself again. Unfortunately, keeping in mind Kayla's young age and the influence our friends have on us at that stage in our life, at that point in our life, this promise didn't even last for 2 days. On Tuesday, August 11th, 2009, Kayla called Hope and informed her that she was going to be hanging out in Natasha's house for the entire day until Natasha went to work at around 5 p.m. When they got to Natasha's house, Kayla's brother was there hanging out with Natasha's brother and Kayla's brother, Jimmy's best friend, 24-year-old Kevin Kilcheski. Kevin had known Kayla and Jimmy, they've all known each other their whole lives. He used to sleep at their house. He had dinner with them. Hope, Kayla, their father, James, Jimmy, they all considered him kind of like another part of the family, an older brother figure for Kayla, another son for Kayla and Jimmy's parents. That's how close this kid was. So when Natasha had to go to work at 5 p.m. that night at a local restaurant, Kayla decided that she was going to stay and hang out with her older brother and his best friend, Kevin. It was later found out, Kayla's friends would state that Kevin was one of the main people who would give these underage girls a ride to Wausau for parties. They all considered him like a protective older brother. He saw it as his job to protect them, which is why he would kind of cart them around wherever they needed to go without a problem. He was a fixture in their friend group. He was kind of always around. That's just Kevin. It didn't really matter that he was 24 years old, 9, 10, 11 years older than all of them, or 8, 9, 10, 10 years older than all of them. Sorry, guys. Kayla and Kevin chatted a little bit, and the two of them made plans to meet up later in the night, which wasn't anything unusual, again. A little bit later, after making these plans with Kevin, Kayla went home and spent some time with her father. At around 8:45, Kevin called the house and spoke to Kayla, and a few minutes later, he came and picked her up at her dad's house. Unfortunately, when she said goodbye to her father, this would be the last time anyone in Kayla's family would ever see her at all. The last confirmed sighting of Kayla was that night, the night of August 11th, 2009, at 9:30 p.m. Kayla's friend Beth, who worked at the local McDonald's, said that Kayla stopped in. She was her usual happy, bubbly self. Beth said that she saw Kevin sitting in the car waiting. Kayla had gotten some food, and she told Beth that the plan was for her and Kevin to just drive around and smoke pot for a few hours for, the rest of the night or whatever, and that Kayla would call Beth once Beth was home from her shift at McDonald's later on that night. Beth never received that phone call. On Wednesday, August 12th, when Kayla's father James woke up and saw that Kayla had not come home that night, nor had she called, it's not that he was really worried, but he was extremely frustrated because of recent events. Remember, Kayla had promised that she was going to keep in constant contact, let her parents, at least one of them, know where she was at all times. So he decided to call Hope to see if maybe Kayla had just, called Hope instead of him and let her know where she was and what she was doing and why she didn't come home the night before. When he couldn't get a hold of Hope the first time he called, he then thought that he would call Kevin because he remembered that Kayla had told him that Kevin was outside to pick her up, and that's who she was going to be hanging out with. Kevin told James that after hanging out for a while, he dropped Kayla off at her friend's house late the night before. James is definitely annoyed and frustrated, but only because of the recent events. Again, the promises that were made. But at this point, he doesn't see any cause for concern. If Kevin said he dropped Kayla off late at night, as per her request at a friend's house, then he guessed that's what happened. Kevin at this point was not asked what friend's house, where, or any of that information. He just said he dropped her off at a friend's house late the night before. James assumed that he would just see Kayla later on when she came home, or she would get in touch with him at some point. As the hours start to tick by, though, when he hasn't seen or heard anything from Kayla, he does start getting worried and decides to try to call Hope again, which he gets the voicemail, so he leaves her a voicemail asking if she's seen or heard from Kayla and kind of explaining a little bit the situation that's going on. Remember, this is all house phones, landline phones. None of these people were calling from cell phones, not the parents or Kayla. Kevin had a cell phone. But on Thursday, August 13th, Hope returned James's phone call, and James reiterated to her that he still had not seen Kayla since 2 nights before when she left to go and hang out with Kevin. He reiterated to her what Kevin had told him about hanging out with Kayla for a little while and then dropping her off at a friend's house late. And again, Hope was extremely frustrated. She was angry because of the promises made. She was a little bit worried, but if you remember, it was just a few days earlier on the 9th, I believe it was the 9th, that Kayla and her friend Natasha had essentially went missing, and Hope had panicked and went to the police station. So she had this in her mind, and she kind of let it go and did the same things James did and figured she would see or hear from Kayla soon, and she would definitely deal with her then. The next day, however, Hope's frustration is mounting, her anger is really building up, and she's starting to get worried. So she decides she's going to track down her daughter. She calls every single one of Kayla's friends, acquaintances that she possibly can, and goes and looks for her. She's trying to figure out just where she is. It's at this point that she realizes that nobody has seen or heard from Kayla since Beth saw her at the McDonald's 3 nights earlier when she was with Kevin. The next day on August 15th, Kayla's brother Jimmy gets in touch with his mom and tells her that Kayla is at a friend's house. It doesn't say the name of this friend, who this friend was, and he gives his mom the number to this friend's house, and he said that he knows Kayla is there, that he heard Kayla is there, and that's where she's been staying. So if Hope needs to get in touch with her, that she can call over there. So Hope, while frustrated and angry at Kayla, she's relieved. Okay, she knows where her daughter is now. She tries for an entire day to get in touch with this friend, and when she finally does get in touch with them on the 16th, when they finally get back to her, they tell her there must be a miscommunication somewhere because they hadn't seen Kayla in a while and she was never staying at their house. So she doesn't know why anyone would have told Jimmy that for Jimmy to tell Hope. So now Hope realizes has been missing this whole time and is still missing. Nobody has seen or heard from her since Beth saw her at the McDonald's. Now, keep in mind, Hope had been trying to get in touch with Kevin for days since James told her that, what Kevin had told him about the last time he saw Kayla. And it's on this day that Kevin finally gets in touch with Hope, but he only text messages her. And he says the exact same thing that he told James earlier, that he was hanging out with Kayla. And late at night, he, by her request, dropped her off at a friend's house. That's all he'll say. He'll only text. He won't answer phone calls. And he won't respond to any questions that were asked from Hope or anyone else after that. Like, I'm sure she asked him what friend's house, where. Nothing in response. All he would do would reiterate one time through text message, days after she originally tried getting in touch with him, the same thing he had told James about dropping Kayla off. Suspicious. Finally, after pressing enough for more details from Kevin, he ended up being less than helpful. Suddenly, he couldn't remember anything. He couldn't remember where he had dropped Kayla off because Kayla was directing him, and he just didn't know. He couldn't remember anything. It's at this point when Hope decides to reach out to Kayla's now ex-boyfriend Miguel, the one in Wausau that was throwing these parties. I guess by now, being so worried, she had gotten his information, but unfortunately, he told her that he had not seen Kayla since the weekend before she had gone missing, the Friday before she'd gone missing, in fact, when she had come to his house in Wausau for a party. On Monday, August 17th, 2009, 6 days after anyone had seen her or heard from her, Hope then decides to go and finally report Kayla missing. At first, the police really just kind of didn't put her as an endangered missing child or an endangered missing person. They classified her and categorized her as a runaway because you remember just, a week earlier, was about to be reported missing and she wasn't. She had just not gotten in touch with her parents. It was a false alarm. I guess they didn't want to waste resources, so they took the report, but they really didn't do anything about it. They just listed her as a runaway. They had also received information while doing a cursory kind of small investigation, just talking to Kayla's friends, that she did have kind of a nomadic lifestyle where she bounced around from here to here to here. And sometimes it was a day or two before she'd get in touch with her parents and where people would go without seeing her. So this kind of nomadic lifestyle that Kayla was allowed to have is kind of what stalled the investigation even more than the original 6 days because of the nomadic lifestyle that the parents didn't realize she was missing. Insane. It's just insane. Investigators do try to find Kayla because she is 15 and you can't just run away when you're 15 years old. But if you think about it, if you know anything about it, or even if you just use your common sense, the investigation for a runaway teenager is a lot different than the investigation for a missing, endangered teenager. While interviewing friends again, the police find out about Wausau, about Kayla's supposed alleged drug dealing boyfriend Miguel, all the parties, which I'm sure didn't help them to think she wasn't a runaway. However, when they speak to Kayla's best friend Natasha, Natasha informs them that it doesn't matter if she was in Wausau or if she was in Antigo and not talking to anyone else, she definitely would have talked to Natasha. And on the night Kayla was supposed to call Beth after Beth's shift ended at the McDonald's, the last night Kayla was seen or heard from, she had also spoken to Natasha. If you remember earlier in the day, she was at Natasha's house. She was also supposed to call Natasha when Natasha got out of work or when she got back from driving around smoking weed with Kevin, and Natasha never received that call. So Natasha was worried right from the door, and she reiterated this also to the investigators, that something was more than likely wrong because this was her best friend and she hadn't even reached out to her. And she wasn't hiding going to Wausau or going to parties or drinking or doing drugs from her. That was her best friend who did these things with her. Eventually, investigators get around to speaking to Kevin, who is the last known person to have seen or heard from Kayla, as far as everyone knows. He reiterates the same story that he had randomly dropped Kayla off at a random friend's house as per her request, and he couldn't remember where the friend's house was because Kayla was giving him directions. However, eventually, when pressed a little bit further, Kevin states that he did know where he dropped Kayla off. He was just worried to say anything. He had dropped her off in Wausau at Miguel's house where all the parties were thrown, where he had lived with his brothers, where Kevin had brought Kayla and even her friends and dropped them off so many times before for parties. Sounds kind of reasonable, right? He did say that he did not even wait to see Kayla get in the door, that he backed out of the driveway and pulled off before he even saw her go to the door and gain entry into the home. Like, he didn't wait to see her get in, essentially. He just left her standing out there in the dark in the middle of the night at Miguel's house. The reason I do this is because there's a problem with that. Unfortunately, that house had been condemned and Miguel had not lived there in months. Kayla was aware that Miguel had not lived there in months because if you remember, Miguel had said that he had seen Kayla at his house for a party the Friday before she disappeared. So she knew where his new address was. She knew where his new house was. So essentially, Kevin said that he dropped Kayla off at Miguel's house, which he gave the East Wausau Avenue address. Okay. Which doesn't really make sense because why would Kayla be asking to get dropped off in an abandoned house? If she wanted to go see Miguel, why didn't she get it dropped off at his new house? She knew where it was. She had been there plenty of times. Kayla's best friend Natasha had told the police that while Kayla and Miguel were not officially back together, they were definitely considering reconciling. Again, she spent the weekend at his house. They were kind of like very close to getting back together. They were like seeing each other again. This information was enough for investigators to reconsider listing Kayla as a runaway, and they then listed her as an endangered missing child, and this happened on August 20th, just 3 days after she was reported as missing by her parents, by Hope. As both the authorities and Kayla's friends and family started considering Kevin's story, they started growing more and more suspicious of his information. Hope later said, quote, "My daughter was extremely afraid of the dark. She had nightmares about people taking her and doing bad things to her. So for her to get out at a vacant house that is completely dark with no one around, that's not my Kayla," end quote. Investigators also found it odd that nobody knew Kayla was having any plans to go to Wausau that night. Why didn't she mention it to Beth at the McDonald's? Why didn't she mention it to Natasha? You know, why had she just told Beth that she was going to ride around and smoke pot with Kevin for the rest of the night until she went back home to her father's house where she would call Beth and call Natasha? Why was she keeping it so secret? The next person investigators decided to speak to was Kayla's ex-boyfriend, kind of boyfriend, Miguel Marrero. So they contacted the police in Wausau and asked them to go to Miguel's new house and just check him out, interview him, and see if Kayla was there. And that's exactly what Wausau police did. Miguel was very cooperative at first, and they saw no sign that Kayla was staying there or had been there. And they also went to the condemned building where Miguel and his brothers used to live, where Kevin alleged that he had dropped Kayla off that night. And they saw no sign that anyone had entered or even exited the building, because remember, it was all boarded up. All the locks were on, all the, boards were in place. So it seemed that nobody had even been on that property. So if she did get dropped off there, she didn't go in that house. Finally, all this time later, I guess because it had been switched to an endangered missing child case instead of a runaway, and because of the suspiciousness and shadiness of Kevin's story, and because Miguel was an alleged drug dealer and Kayla was a 15-year-old kind of innocent girl, the media finally picked up this case, the local media. So they started running it on news channels that Kayla was missing and giving out all of the information. Kayla's family and friends, bound together at this point, started putting up missing persons flyers and tips started pouring in, but not a single one of them ever amounted to anything. And this is where I can get into specific tips and what authorities did to track them down, who they spoke to, and we thought this tip was going to be something. But that's just so much information to put in this video that never amounted to anything. Obviously, the authorities' two main persons of interest or prime suspects, I've seen it put both ways, were Kevin and Miguel. But they didn't have any evidence or anything that could really allow them to do anything but a cursory investigation into the two men. There were quite a few reported sightings of Kayla, but Hope would review all of these sightings, all of the footage of these sightings when possible, and none of them ever amounted to anything either. Kayla had not been seen or heard from since the night that she was driving around and smoking weed with Kevin. Eventually, with nowhere to go, nothing to do, and all the leads and tips running dry, the leads going nowhere, the authorities turned their sights back on Kevin and Miguel. They took cadaver dogs and search parties to Miguel's old house in Wausau. They searched it inside and out. There was no sign that anyone had ever been in there since it was condemned and boarded up, especially not Kayla. And they even searched the surrounding woods with cadaver dogs and search parties. They had divers go into a lake that was in the surrounding woods of this house. Nothing ever came of anything. The dogs didn't pick up anything. The searchers never found anything. The divers who went into the lake did not find anything. There was no hide nor hair of Kayla Berg. Where was she? At this point, investigators were getting very frustrated, and they decided to really look at and pick apart the story of the last person who was known to have ever seen Kayla or heard from her, and that was Kevin. They looked into his timeline for the night Kayla went missing, and they determined from where Kevin lived with his parents, it was approximately an hour drive from the abandoned house in Wausau to his house. He had continuously stated that he had dropped Kayla off at around 10:30 p.m. that night, and Kevin's mother was the only person who could alibi him, and she stated that she had seen Kevin home in their house at around midnight. I guess Kevin lived with his mommy at 24. This only left a half-hour frame of time between dropping Kayla off and arriving at his house. Like, if he had done something, he would have only had that half hour if his mother was telling the truth and not just giving him a false alibi, which obviously, how could the police know that? It was at this point in the investigation that Kevin lawyered up, refused cooperating, refused to talk to anybody, including investigators, about the case. He completely shut down and hid behind his attorneys. He felt like he was being harassed for no reason, and with the media coverage, that it was really affecting his life, the life of his family, and he didn't want to deal with it anymore. He didn't want to speak to the media. He didn't want to speak to police. He didn't want to speak to Kayla's family anymore. Obviously, this caused a huge rift. This was Kayla's brother Jimmy's best friend. He was like an older brother to Kayla. They'd known each other. They were lifelong friends, and this is where it broke because he just wouldn't cooperate anymore. He couldn't take the pressure, essentially. In my opinion, allegedly. The police even managed to concoct an arrest for Kevin in October of 2009 for child endangerment because he admittedly and knowingly smoked an illegal substance, marijuana, with an underage child, Kayla, because technically she's a minor. She's considered a child. Eventually, though, years later, those charges would be dropped and nothing more about Kayla's disappearance would be learned from Kevin or really anybody else. The one small thing the arrest did gain was it gave authorities access to Kevin and to be able to speak to him and try to get more information out of him, but he was not giving in about the last time he saw Kayla. His attorney had said for him not to talk, and he would not speak to them. However, another thing that did come out of this arrest was that the authorities were now able to have Kevin's Jeep forensically searched. They had used an alternate light source at one point, but now they were able to luminol it and really go through it and have it forensically examined. They were doing the same exact thing to Miguel's vehicle at this point, but at this point, Miguel was still cooperating. He gave them full permission to do any kind of search of his vehicles, home, himself, and he gave them everything that they wanted, granted his permission. However, nothing came out of either search of either vehicle. At this point, with no new leads, no new evidence, no new tips coming in, the small police department of Antigo, and I really commend them for this, decided that they needed help. So they reached out to the much larger police station from the much larger city of Madison and asked them to come in. Madison sent their detective Karen Corcoran and her cadaver dogs to assist the investigation. Now, keep in mind, these dogs are very well trained to only note the scent of decomposition of human beings. They're to ignore animal decomposition, anything else. They are live humans. They only pick up the decomposition of human beings. Keep that in mind. In December of 2009, Karen and her dogs were to go through and around 10 different vehicles. Some of them were random police vehicles. Some of them were just, random people's vehicles. But 2 of the vehicles were most important because one was Kevin's Jeep and the other was Miguel's vehicle. That these dogs were going to be sniffing around and trying to note the scent of human decomposition in and around any of these vehicles. Karen was not told anything about what case the police were investigating, so she didn't unconsciously lead the dogs or, anything like that she would do subconsciously or unconsciously. The dogs indicated on one vehicle and one vehicle only, Kevin's Jeep. However, this only frustrated the authorities because cadaver dogs hitting on the scent of human decomposition at Kevin's Jeep wasn't near enough to do anything to move forward in the case. Investigators then decided to subpoena cell phone records from Kevin and Miguel and all friends and family who were in contact with Kayla in the day of and the dates leading up to her disappearance. Again, Kevin's phone records were the only ones that had any kind of suspicious activity connected to them. Authorities saw that while he had called her right before going to pick her up, as previously stated, but then all of his activity on his phone stopped until 2 p.m. the next day. So either his phone died, coincidentally, right around the last time it was known that Kayla was alive and that he had been dropping her off right after that time, or he purposely shut it off. However, after further review of his phone records, the police saw that in the days before and after Kayla's disappearance, Kevin had done this numerous times. So it could have just been a coincidence at that point they came to find out. Regarding the search of Miguel's phone records, they were able to see that he was telling the truth about the last time he spoke to Kayla. Miguel at this point hired a lawyer and stopped communicating with investigators when they requested another meeting with him, wanting to review a second older cell phone of his. I'll get to this in theories, but I think there was a whole other reason that had nothing to do with Kayla that scared Miguel. Scared him into not cooperating anymore. Remember, he was an alleged drug dealer. After a few more months of nothing going forward in the case, the police, not wanting it to go cold, decided to call in Detective Corcoran and her very well-trained cadaver dogs again. They didn't want the case to stall. They had suspicions of one of 2 of these men who had done something, or perhaps both, and they didn't want to let it go. They were like a dog with a bone, if you will. So what they did was, over the next several months, they conducted inch-by-inch area searches with search parties and the cadaver dogs in 12 separate locations in wooded areas around Antigo. The dogs hit in 2 separate locations that they smelled human decomposition in these 2 locations. It just so happened that both of these locations were connected with one person that was already a suspect in the case. Can you guess who? Go ahead, I'll wait. Kevin Kilcheski. Suspicious. The first hit was on a parcel of land that was owned by Kevin's parents, and the second time the dogs alerted, the second place, was on a potato farm that Kevin worked at. Obviously, this renewed the investigators' interest in Kevin. I mean, the cadaver dogs had also hit only on his Jeep out of 10 vehicles that they were ran through. So now this is 2 separate locations connected with Kevin, a parcel of land owned by his parents, and the potato farm where he worked at, and his Jeep, all being sniffed out and alerted by cadaver dogs for the scent of human decomposing, essentially, remains. So the smell of a dead body in all 3 of these places connected to him. 3 separate hits by specially trained and highly skilled cadaver dogs involving the last person to see Kayla alive. I'm just reiterating, guys. because to this day, this case is still unsolved and nobody has been held accountable. Unfortunately, once again, all of these hits by these dogs, this coincidence, I guess this is circumstantial evidence, wasn't enough to do anything to move forward in the case against Kevin, and it didn't help in any way to find Kayla. Here's where the case started growing cold, and in 2011, Kayla's father died of cancer, never knowing what happened to his only daughter. It's so sad. I could swear I've seen people arrested and charged with murder for less than this. Years later, in an effort to get the case moving forward again, the Antigo Police Department called in the FBI and NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, to help generate leads and to help get people interested in the case again to try and find Kayla. There were still no answers. She had still not been seen or heard from. The FBI posted a $20,000 reward for anyone with any information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever was responsible for Kayla's disappearance, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children gave age-progressed photos from 2 years after Kayla went missing, and they did this all the way up until she was 22 years old. Each year they came out with a new photo. The authorities investigated a few other leads involving human trafficking, but nothing ever came out of any of them. Obviously, with nothing new ever coming out in this case, no information ever turning up, still to this day, speculation, as it does, ran rampant, but nothing with any factual or evidentiary value had been ever found. And there are still sightings to this day. However, all of them have been investigated and none of them have been Kayla. Police still run down any lead they can get, no matter where it is throughout the country, wherever it is, but nothing ever moves forward in Kayla's case. If you've heard about this case before, you know the Hey Walter video. I'm not going to get into all that because it's not relevant. It ended up not being Kayla. So if you want to look into that, like I said, feel free to deep dive, investigate on your own. Now I want to talk about theories. Could Kevin have been telling the truth? Could Kayla have actually asked him to drop her off at Miguel's old abandoned house in Wausau because she was meeting somebody? Was she having some kind of intimate relationship with somebody who wasn't Miguel that she never told anybody about, and they did something with her, or she met foul play? Another theory is, part of that theory was she meeting Miguel there for some reason? Miguel's phone did show that on that night he had driven like 2 hours away to somewhere, and for some reason police thought that was suspicious. Again, do your own research on that. I really didn't understand why it was suspicious. Like maybe he had picked her up and brought her somewhere. I don't really get it. Could she have been meeting someone? Is that a reasonable thought? In my opinion, it's just not plausible that she would have some kind of secret love affair she never told anybody about. This is a 15-year-old girl. She has best friends she talks to about everything. 15-year-old girls in love with somebody or having an intimate relationship, they're going to tell at least one person. At least. Plus, she was talking to her friends about getting back together with Miguel. That was her first real boyfriend. I'm sure it was her first love, and he was interested in getting back together with her. So one, why would he hurt her? And two, why would she be cheating on him and meeting someone in the pitch black in the middle of the night at an abandoned house in this big city far away from where she lived for some kind of secret rendezvous? It just doesn't make sense to me. Respectfully disagree in the comments. Let me know what you think. On to the next theory. Oh, before I get to that, remember also that investigators had searched that house inside and out numerous times. They had cadaver dogs go through the woods around the house. Divers jumped in the lake or the water, whatever it was around there. There was never ever evidence that Kayla had been there that night or that anybody, for that matter, had been inside. There was nothing left behind, not even a hair. They combed through it meticulously on more than one occasion and brought dogs in, specially trained dogs. So no, in my opinion, not reasonable moving forward. Theory number 2. This one's getting into what I just said about maybe Miguel met her and got her into human trafficking or something, or did something to her at this house and then drove her all these miles away where his phone pinged. But keep in mind, Miguel was a grown adult and he was also an alleged drug dealer. I know this may be a little bit confusing, but again, do your own research. I didn't really understand what they were saying about his phone pinging. Something like it pinged in the area of the house around 10:30. And then it went all the way like 2 hours away to a different town or a different city. I didn't know why it was suspicious. It didn't seem to have anything to do with the case. So again, this theory really doesn't make sense. This kid was an alleged known drug dealer. So maybe that's why, again, I reiterate, he didn't want the police looking into his old phone. It was probably a burner second phone that he used to make his deals, allegedly, supposedly. This brings us to the third, final, and in my opinion, most obvious and most plausible theory. Kevin Kilcheski, his being the last person she was ever seen with, his refusal to cooperate, his shadiness with giving details and recounting the last night with Kayla, and the 3 cadaver dog hits, I think all speak for themselves. Again, they make him the most likely and the most probable suspect. And this did not escape police or Kayla's family or the media or anybody who pays any attention or takes 10 minutes to look into this case or even the hour to watch the disappeared episode. But there was never enough evidence to convict him, to even put charges on him. He didn't even get charged with child endangerment. The judge dropped it. And the reason the judge dropped it was because the judge said something like, we can't prove that he was with, or that he was the last person to see Kayla and that he didn't drop her off. What does that have to do with him admitting, a grown man, 24 years old, to driving around and smoking illegal at the time, and I think probably still now in Wisconsin, I'm not sure, marijuana with this 15-year-old girl? So the judge essentially gave his reasoning for dropping the charges and not convicting Kevin on the child endangerment as the reasons that he didn't see there could be a conviction or a guilty verdict against Kevin for murder. That doesn't make sense. But as confusing as it is, that's what I read. I wholeheartedly believe that Kevin is getting away with murder today. I think maybe he had some kind of attraction to Kayla, and because they were high that night or something, decided to make a move. She fought back, and he did something to hurt her and disposed of her body. He worked on a potato farm. Does he know how to do something with bodies to make them decompose to where there's nothing left? I mean, it's just so obvious. I don't understand how this guy is still walking around. I looked for recent developments in this case, and nothing new has come to light. Authorities conducted another search in a national forest area near where Kayla was last seen on October 19th, 2019, but nothing at all came of it. That's it for the disappearance of Kayla Berg. I feel so horrible for her family. This is another case with like so much obvious information and, like, in my opinion, an obvious suspect, and nothing's being done for justice for this young, little, poor 15-year-old girl and her family. Her mother's devastated. Can you imagine how she feels? Let me know what you think in the comments, guys. Again, if you have any suggestions for cases you want me to cover, or even anything in my addiction and recovery, please let me know. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Give me that massive thumbs up. I always appreciate it. And I get so many views, but then I only get like a tiny bit of likes. And I'm trying my best, guys. Again, I'm updating my equipment soon. So turn on your notification bell and you'll get to see my smiling and happy face whenever I upload. Keep your eyes peeled for this week. I'm going to try to, like I said, do a little bit more because I didn't get to this weekend, but I may just take it easy until Saturday and surprise y'all with a bunch of videos. So, what else? I guess that's it. Be kind to each other. It doesn't cost anything. If you have any information on Kayla Berg, contact the Antigo Police Department in Antigo, Wisconsin, or the FBI. Have your best day. I love you guys and appreciate you so, so much. Thanks for watching. I hope you made it all the way through.